All right, guys, this is going to be a really basic React tutorial, and hopefully it will shed some light and to get you accustomed to React. Now, the only things we're going to cover in this quick tutorial is components, so React components, how to pass data to React components, how to fetch data, for example, from an API using React components, and we're only going to go over two hooks. So we're going to go over useState and useEffect. Now, the reason I've created this tutorial is because a lot of my Udemy courses actually use React. So for example, my Next.js courses, my Gatsby courses, I've got a course on WordPress block development as well, which uses React, as well as my new Astro course. We cover a little bit of React in that course, but not too much. But the whole reason I've created this tutorial is if you're unfamiliar with React, hopefully this will give you the bare basic knowledge you need to start writing some React code. So as you can see, this is the app we're going to be building. It's incredibly simple. All we're going to do is create an accordion component, which can be expanded. Now, this first name and last name, we're going to be pulling from a mock API using JSON server. Additionally, we can toggle the opening and closing of an accordion, but also only one accordion will be able to be open at a time. So if we click on My Hobbies, then the My profile will automatically close. So we've got a little bit of complexity here as well. So I know you're thinking this is incredibly simple, but it does cover all the basic things you're going to need when working with React, like props. We're going to create components. We're going to do a little bit of styling as well. So I'm going to show you how to use some styling with class names and inline styles. And like I said, we're going to be fetching some basic data from a mock API. With that said, let's create our first React project. So first of all, let's open up VS Code. Let's open up a new terminal in VS Code, and we're going to create our new React project now. To do that, we can use the npx create react app command. So we can go npx in the terminal here, and followed by create-react-app, followed by the name of the project we want to create. So I'm going to call it React Basic Tut. So then the create react app package will create a new directory based on our project name. So create a new directory called React Basic Tut. So once our project has finished setting up, we can then change directory into our new project using the cd command. So let's cd into React Basic Tut. Then let's open up this new project in a new VS Code window using the code dot command. So this will open up a new VS Code window for our React Basic Tut project. And from here, before we take a look at any code, we want to gut out this project because it contains a little bit of boilerplate which we don't want to be looking at. We just want a clean slate. So let's remove all of these files. Let's remove app.css, app.test.js, logo.svg, report webvitals.js, and setuptest.js. Let's delete all of these files. Then within our app.js, let's remove all of the markup that gets returned from the app function. And we're just going to return a div, an empty div here. We want to remove the import, the logo import to the top here, and the app.css import. Then in index.js, we want to remove the import of the report web vitals and remove the call to this function at the bottom of our index.js file. From here, we're now starting with a pretty much blank slate for our project. So let's open up a new terminal in VS Code and let's run our project to see what we've got. So let's run npm start to start our new React project. And this will spool up a local development server, which we can then access from localhost 3000. Let's open this up in the browser and we can't see anything because we're starting with a blank slate. However, we know our project is working because we can access localhost 3000 in the browser. So let's head on back to our project then, and let's take a look and see what's actually happening in our project. So our entire React app is going to be rendered within a div whose ID is root. Now we can find this by going to public and index.html. So this index.html is the HTML page that gets rendered in the browser at localhost 3000. But then React will get loaded in. If we scroll down to body here, our React app will get loaded in to this div with ID root. So to prove this, above the div with ID root, let's add another div. And we're not going to have an ID on this, but we're going to say this div is outside of our React app. So if we save index.html, and before we take a look in the browser, we want to open up index.js. Let's take a look to see what's happening here. We're using react-dom.createRoot, passing in document.getElementById, whose ID is equal to root. So we just saw that div in index.html. So then this line here is going to set the root of our React app to this root div. So then it's going to render the app component. We can see here, we're importing app from ./app. It's going to render the app component within this div, whose ID is root. So let's open up app.js. We can see we're not returning anything from our app component. So let's just say in here, this is the app component. Let's save this now and take a look in the browser. And there we go. We can see we have two sets of text here. We have this div is outside of our React app, and this is the app component. Now, the only thing that you need to know about React is when you're first starting out is React just provides you a set of tools to update a web page. That's it, just to update the content on a web page. That's literally all it is. So if we head on back to our code, within our source and app.js here, this is known as a React component. And it's very basic. Essentially, all a React component is a function which returns some markup. That's literally all it is. It's a function which returns some markup. Now, common practice in React is, for our React components, we always name React components with an uppercase letter. We can see it has an uppercase A here for app. Now, the file name doesn't matter, but it makes sense that we match the file name with the name of the function or the name of the component. So we always have to create React components with an uppercase letter. With that said, right now, our app isn't really doing much. Ideally, what we want to do is create some more components to render on our screen and potentially update some of the content on our screen. So we want two accordions. Now, all we need to do is create a single accordion component, and we can render multiple instances of that component. Let's do this then. Within our source directory, let's create a new file, and we're going to call it accordion.js. Then we need to create a function, and remember, it needs to begin with an uppercase letter here. So we're going to have accordion here, and we always need to return some markup from a React component. So the markup we're going to return for now, let's just return a div that says this is an accordion. So if we save this now and try to render this new component in our app.js, instead of rendering this div here with this is the app component text, let's still render the div, but within the div, let's render an accordion. Now, before we render this accordion, we need to import the accordion at the top of our app.js file. We need to import accordion from /accordion, like so. Now, I'm getting an error down in the console here, and that is because in accordion.js, all we've done is created the component. Ideally, we want to mark this component as being able to be imported in any other component and rendered anywhere else in our app. So to do this, to be able to import this component within our app component, we need to export. Now, there's two ways to export in JavaScript. We can use named exports or we can use default exports. Now, a default export like this, export default function accordion, will mean anytime we import from our accordion file, our accordion.js, we can name this import whatever we want. We could name this Bob, for example, and render Bob like so, and this would work. However, with named exports, if we just remove the default here, we want to export function accordion, we have to import accordion named like so. So it has to be accordion, which means in our app component, we'd have to import accordion like so from /accordion. However, for this example, we're going to use a default export, which means we can import accordion like so, and we need to render accordion in our markup down here, and we need to export default function accordion. So if we head on back to our app component, what we're doing here is rendering our accordion component. So let's save our app component then and take a look in the browser. And there we go. We can see we're rendering this is an accordion. Now, the really cool thing with components in React is we could render any number of these accordions and it will create a new instance of these accordions. So let's save this now with our bunch of accordions here and take a look in the browser. And there we go. We're rendering multiple instances now of the accordion component. And they're all self-contained instances. So let's head on back to our code then and build out more of our accordion. Let's remove all the unnecessary accordion renders, and we just want to render one accordion component. Now, ideally for our accordion components, we want to be able to render some data. So when the accordion label is clicked, the small view underneath the accordion will appear and disappear. So we'll toggle that view underneath the accordion. To do this, we can use something called React Children. So instead of a self-closing tag here for accordion, we can specify the closing tag for accordion, and we can pass in anything between these two tags. For example, we could pass in another accordion if we wanted to, or we could pass in some hard-coded string. So I'm going to say some hard-coded string in here. Now remember, anytime we pass anything between these two tags in a React component, this is known as children in React, which means we need some way to render these children for our accordion component. So let's head on back to our accordion component then. And now this is our first introduction to React props. So we can grab our props as the first argument to any component. Now on this props, React is going to add a children property, which is going to contain our hard-coded text because we added it between our two tags for our React accordion component. So in accordion.js then, first of all, let's console log what we have on our props, like so. Now let's take a look in the browser and let's open up our development tools. And let's give our localhost 3000 a refresh, and we can see our console logs here. So let's open up our console log. We can see we have props, and we can see we have children set equal to some hard-coded string. So let's render this then, this children prop, back in our code. Instead of this is an accordion as hard-coded text, we want to render props.children. So we can do this one of two ways. We can use props.children like so, or a more common way is, instead of accessing props dot and then whatever the prop name is all the time, we can just destructure the prop name from that first argument to our React component. So instead of props.children now, we can just render children directly because we've destructured it from our props argument for our React component. So if we save this now then and take a look in the browser, nothing much will have changed because it's rendering exactly the same code. However, now if we take a look back in our code again, and in our app.js, let's copy this accordion component and render a new instance of this accordion component. But now let's change some text. So I'm going to say new accordion in here. If we save this now and take a look in the browser, there we go. We can see these are completely separate from each other. Even though they're an accordion component, these are completely separate instances of an accordion component. So that's what I mean by this self-contained. We can create multiple instances of the same component, and those instances don't affect each other. Now, another thing to note as well with React Children is if we head on back to our code, this doesn't have to be hard-coded text or a string. It could be anything. We could pass in more markup if we wanted to. For example, we could have a div here with a strong tag that says my first accordion. We could have a paragraph text underneath saying my p tag. Let's save this now and take a look in the browser. And there we go. We can see all this is rendering correctly as the children to the accordion component. So we can render anything as children to a React component, including other components, other React components. With that said, we want to cater for, in our accordion, ideally we'll pass in some label text to render as the accordion label. To do this then, all we need to do is pass something called a prop to our accordion. Now a prop can be anything we want to call it. So we want to pass some label text down, so it makes sense that we call our prop label text like so. Now our label text for our first accordion is going to be my profile. Then the label text for the second accordion, let's pass in label text here as a prop, is going to be my hobbies, like so. Now all we need to do to access this label text prop is within our accordion. Again, it's going to be passed as part of the first argument to the React component. So we can destructure then label text from the first argument. Remember, we're destructuring children, so a long-handed way of doing this would be grabbing our props here. And then instead of children here, we'd render props.children. And for our label text, we could render props.label text like so. However, it's a lot cleaner to destructure all of our props from the first argument, so we can destructure label text and children like so. So instead of accessing props.label text, we access label text and children directly like so. Now, one thing I didn't mention as well is, anytime we want to render something within HTML markup, we can just use these curly braces. So anytime we want to add some JavaScript expression or reference a variable or anything to do with JavaScript within our returned markup for a React component, we can just use the curly braces like so. So now, before we save this and take a look in the browser, we want to wrap our children in a div. Let's wrap our children in a div like this. Now let's save this and take a look in the browser. And there we go. We can see we have my profile because that's the label text prop we passed down to our first accordion. And my hobbies was the label text we passed down to the second accordion. So let's now take a look at, first of all, we'll add a bit of styling to our label texts. So let's head on back to our code for our accordion component. Ideally, we'll wrap our label text here in another div like so. So now we can add some styling to our accordion. Now, all we need to do is import a CSS file to our React component. So at the top here, I'm going to import /accordion.css, which means we need to actually create this CSS file. So in our source directory, let's create a new file called accordion.css. Now, again, it's good practice to keep our naming convention exactly the same. Anytime we have a CSS file associated with a component, it's good practice to keep both of these file names exactly the same. And of course, only the extension will be different. So we've got accordion.js and accordion.css. Then on our accordion top level div here, instead of adding a class, which we would expect to do in normal HTML, because all of this file is JavaScript, class is actually a reserved word in JavaScript, which means whenever we're working with React components and we want to apply a class to a particular HTML element, we need to use class name like so. Then we can apply any class name we want. So I'm going to add accordion here. And then within the accordion, we'll have, for our label text, we'll just have label-text. Now let's target the accordion label text then in accordion.css. Let's go accordion here, and we want to target the label-text. Now let's add some padding around this. We're going to add a 10 pixel padding. Let's add a font weight, and we're going to have a font weight bold. Let's add a text color of red, and let's add a cursor pointer so the users know they can click on this label text to toggle the opening and closing of this accordion. So let's save our accordion.css file. And remember, we're importing this accordion.css file now into our accordion component. So these styles should work. So if we save this and take a look in the browser, there we go. We can see we have our label text with the different styling now compared to the rest of our text. So let's improve this styling. Let's add some hover effect. Whenever we hover over the label text, let's add label text hover. We want a background color of, I'm going to put DDD here, which is a slightly light gray. So again, if we take a look in the browser and we hover over our accordion label text, we can see this is all working correctly. However, now what we want to do is, ideally, we want to be able to click on the accordion label text. And when we do so, we'll open up the children for that accordion instance. So it'll only affect this particular accordion or the accordion that was clicked. We'll open and close, we'll toggle the opening and closing of the children for that accordion. So again, let's take a look in our code. What we can do is in our accordion.js, at the top of our file here, we can use something called a React hook. And the specific hook we're going to use is the useState hook. Now, hooks in React are essentially self-contained bits of logic which have the potential to rerun anytime something in that hook was changed or anytime data in that hook was changed. Now, if that sounds too confusing, don't worry, because it's better to look at it through an example. So let's use the example of the useState hook to control the opening and closing of our accordion. So here we can use const, and we want to open up a set of square brackets. We want to create an open and a set open variable, and we'll set this equal to useState, and this will be imported at the top of our file here from React. And it's going to be a function, and the function will only take one argument, and that is the default state for this state item. So this open is only going to either be true or false. It's going to be open or it's going to be closed. So open will be true or false. The default state will be false, which means the accordion will be closed by default. So all this useState hook does is it returns an array with two elements in the array. The first element is going to be the value of the state item, and the second element is going to be a function which will be responsible for updating the value of that state item. So we could call the first and second element of the array that's returned from useState we could call it anything we want. We don't have to call it open and set open. In fact, we could call this open and set open if you want to, Bob. This is a completely valid name to call the second element from useState. However, it's always good practice to name whatever our state item is in the first element, name the second element set open or prefix with set. So this will be a function which will be responsible for setting the value for this state item. Which means then we only want to render these children if open is true. Now we can use conditional rendering in React. And because we're going to be using some JavaScript within our markup here, we need to open up another set of curly braces. Now we want to check to see if open is true here. So if open is true, we can use the double ampersand to render this particular div and this particular bit of markup. Now if open is false, then it's not going to render this particular markup. With that said, if we save our accordion component now and take a look in the browser, we can see that our accordion children are no longer displaying because by default, we said our state item, our open state item was false. Remember, we passed in false to the first argument of our useState hook, which is the default state for this particular state item. So it's false, which means our children aren't going to be rendered. Now, ideally, what we want to do is we want to add an event handler to our label text. So anytime we click on this div, we'll set open to true. So we can use set open, passing in true, which will change the value of our state item. And because React is very intelligent under the hood, React will know that this value has changed and it will rerun our accordion component and then re-update this particular bit of logic here. And because open will be true, our children will be rendered for this particular instance of our accordion component. However, first we need to be able to add an event handler to our label text. And to do this, in React, we can use onClick. So this is a specific bit of React syntax here. And anytime we want to attach an event to a particular element, we can use on followed by the event name. So you can see in my IntelliSense here, I'm getting a bunch of suggestions all based on different events that we can hook into for this div element. So we've got this huge list of events we can tap into. However, we want to use the onClick event. Now we need to set this equal to a callback function. And because we're going to be using JavaScript here, we need to open up a set of curly braces. And then there's two ways we can pass a callback function to this onClick handler. We could do it inline via an arrow function like so, or we could also pass a function like this. However, the more common way is to create a function within our component called handle followed by the event name, so handle click. So at the top here, we could either go function handle click like so, or we could create an arrow function. So we could go const handle click and set this equal to an arrow function. Either way, it doesn't matter. They're going to do exactly the same thing. And we can pass handle click then into our onClick handler. So because we've attached an onClick handler now, an onClick event handler to this particular div, our label text div, this handle click function is going to run anytime we click on this div. So let's prove this then. Let's just console log for now. This was clicked. If we save this now and take a look in the browser, if we take a look in our console log down here, if we click on our accordion, we can see we're console logging every time this was clicked. However, we don't want to console log anything. Let's go back to our code. We don't want to console log anything. We want to set open to true. So we can use the set open function then. And all we need to do is pass in a new value to this function. And the new value will be true. So let's remove our console log here. Let's save this now and take a look in the browser. Let's click on our first accordion. And there we go. We can see our children appear. Let's click on the second accordion. And there we go. We can see the second accordion children appear. However, what happens when we click on the label text again? Ideally, we want our children to be hidden. They'll hide. This isn't happening at the moment. Anytime we're clicking on our label text again, nothing is actually happening. So let's fix this then back in our code. Instead of using set open equal to true here, what we can do is pass a callback function to set open. Now this callback function will be passed the current value of our useState item. So we can use previous value here. And then all we need to do is return a new value based on this previous value. So we just want to invert the previous value. So if open is true, we just want to set open to false. If open is false, we want to set open to true. So in here, we can return, and we just want to return previous value. So this exclamation mark, because this is a Boolean, it will just invert the previous value. Now, I know you may be thinking, why have we created this crazy, weird callback function here when we could have just inverted the value of open? So in here, we could have just gone open, like so. Now, this probably will work if we use state in this way. However, this is not advised because state updates in React are asynchronous. They're not synchronous, which means this could potentially be, this open here, could potentially be stale data. However, React will make sure that anytime we pass a callback function, that the value to this callback function won't be stale. So we can use the previous value here. Let's go previous value or previous state. It doesn't really matter. And then all we need to do is return previous value like so. So now if we save this and take a look in the browser, let's see what happens when we click on our accordion label text. And there we go. They're hiding and opening as expected. Now from here, I want to show you that we can do a little bit more complex things with our props in our React components. So ideally, instead of having 2 accordion tabs open at the same time, we'll just limit this to only one accordion being able to be open at the same time, which means we need to control this. If we head on back to our code, we need to control the opening and closing of the accordion tabs in the app component. So the app component is going to dictate whether an accordion should be open or not. To do this, we need to pass an ID to each accordion. So we have a unique identifier for each accordion. So let's do that then. Let's pass an ID to each accordion. The first one, I'm just going to add some ID in here. So my-profile, exactly the same. Let's add an ID prop to the accordion. And this is going to be my hobbies, like so. Now, what we're going to do is move the useState hook from the accordion into the app component. So let's do that then. In our app.js, let's create a new state item at the top here. And this state item is going to contain the ID of the currently open accordion. So we can say here, open accordion ID and set open accordion ID. And this will be equal to useState. And by default, we're going to pass null into our state item. So no accordion will be open by default. And remember, you need to import useState at the top here from React. And again, remember, useState returns an array with 2 elements. The first element in the array is the value of the state item. The second element in the array is a function to update the value of the state item. So from here, we also want to add another prop to our accordion, and that is whether this accordion should be open or not. So we want to add a little bit of logic as well to dictate if this accordion is open. So let's pass down our prop. We want to set open equal to either true or false based on if open accordion ID is equal to my profile, or for the second accordion, if it's equal to my hobbies. So for open, we can set equal to open accordion ID is equal to my -profile. And we want to do exactly the same for our second accordion. But instead, we want to only open this accordion if open accordion ID is equal to my-hobbies, like so. So from here, we need to go into our accordion and we want to destructure the new open prop. And then we don't need this state anymore because each accordion isn't going to determine if it's open or not. It's the app component now, which will determine which accordion will be open. So we want to remove our state here. Let's remove the useState hook at the top here as well. And on handle click now, what we want to do is pass a function down to each accordion. And this function will be a callback function, which will take the accordion ID, and then we can use set open accordion ID within our app component. So at the top here, let's go const handle accordion click, and this handle accordion click function will take an accordion ID. So before we implement the logic for this function, we want to pass this handle accordion click down to each accordion. So we can pass an onClick handler. Now, this doesn't have to be called onClick. This could be called anything. However, I'm going to call it onClick to keep in line with the React naming conventions. So we're going to call it onClick, our new prop to our accordion component. We're going to pass handle accordion click. We're going to pass the function down to the accordion component. We need to pass it down to both instances. of our accordion component. Then we can use this onClick function within our accordion component now. We need to destructure the onClick function from our props, and we can call this as a function then. So we can call onClick, and ideally what we'll do is we need to destructure the accordion ID as well. Remember, in our app component, we're passing down an ID to each accordion. What we'll do is pass in the ID of the accordion that was clicked. So anytime we click the first accordion, the app component is going to receive that accordion ID called myProfile from the first accordion as the argument passed to the handle accordion click function. And exactly the same as our second accordion, it's going to be passed by -hobbies. So we can use this accordion ID then. We can use the set accordion or set open accordion ID, passing in the accordion ID which was clicked. So if we save our app component and our accordion component and take a look in the browser now, if we give localhost 3000 a refresh, let's see what happens when we click My Profile. There we go. The children for My Profile open. Let's click on My Hobbies. There we go. My Profile is hidden and My Hobbies children are open. However, when we click My Hobbies again, ideally we want this to hide. So we still want the toggle functionality that we had previously. So let's fix this then. Let's head on back to our code. And what we can do is pass another callback function to the setter function for our state item for the open accordion ID. Then we want to grab the previous value. We want to check to see if, or we want to return here, if previous value is equal to accordion ID, i.e. if we're clicking the same accordion that we just opened, then we want to revert the open accordion ID to null. Else, we'll set it to accordion ID. So if we save this now then and take a look in the browser, let's see what happens now if we click on My Hobbies. There we go. The children hide as expected. Let's open My Profile and everything is working as expected. From here then, there's one last thing I want to cover, and that is the useEffect hook. So useEffect in React is often used to retrieve some data. So to do this, we need to set up a mock API within our project, and we're going to use JSON Server for this. So if we head on over to the documentation for JSON Server, we need to quit running our project and use npm i json-server. So let's head on back to our code, and actually instead of quit running our project, I'm just going to open a new terminal here, a new terminal window in our project, and we want to npm i json-server. Then in the root directory of our project, we just need to create a mock database file, which is just going to be a JSON file. So we can call it db.json, like so. And this is just going to be a JSON object. And we're going to have one property here called profile. And it's going to have a first name. And I'm going to have Tom here and a last name. And this will be web dev education, like so. Now to run our mock API server, we can run in our new terminal here. Remember, our first terminal here is running our React app. So in our second terminal, let's run our mock database, our mock API. To do that, we can use json-server --watch db.json. So we're referencing the JSON file that we just created in the root directory of our project. And we want this to run on port 3001. So we want to go --port followed by 3001. So let's hit enter on this. And we should be able to access now http localhost 3001/profile in the browser. So let's access this URL. And there we go. We can see our mock API now available at localhost 3001/profile. So let's grab this data from within our React project using the useEffect hook. So if we head on back to our React code, for our app.js, instead of hard coding some text in here for our accordion or for our myProfile accordion, we're going to render another React component. So let's first create a profile React component. In our source directory, let's create a new file called profile.js, and we're going to export default function profile. In here, we're just going to return a div for now that just says profile. So we need to render this profile component then in our app component. Let's first import at the top here, profile from /profile. And then we want to render, instead of this HTML markup here, we want to render our new profile component. And because we're not rendering any children for our profile component, we're just going to use a self-closing tag like so. So within the profile component then, We've got our hard-coded profile text here. Let's see if this is working first and rendering correctly. So let's head on back to our browser at localhost 3000. Let's open up the profile, and there we go. We can see we're rendering profile correctly. So let's now load in our profile component. Let's load the data available at localhost 3000/profile. So back in our code then, we can use the useEffect hook, which we need to import at the top here from React. We need to pass a callback function to the first argument to the useEffect hook, and the second argument will be an empty array. Now, this array here that we pass to the useEffect hook is a dependency array, which means if we passed variables into this dependency array, anytime the values of those variables changed, then this callback function would rerun. However, when we pass an empty array to a useEffect hook, this useEffect callback function here is only going to run once whenever this component is mounted, which means this component is going to be mounted actually multiples of times. If we take a look in our app component, for our accordion children, remember we're hiding the children if this accordion is not the open accordion, which means we're going to remove this component, this profile component, from our DOM, and then anytime we open up this accordion again, we're going to re-render this profile component, which means this callback function is going to run every single time we open the accordion that renders this profile component. With that said, we need to grab the data from our mock API. So we can go const here, fetch data, and set this equal to an asynchronous function. And within this asynchronous function, we need to grab a const response and set this equal to await fetch. We want to grab the data at http localhost 3001/profile. Then we want to grab the JSON from this response, so we can go const data and set this equal to await response.json. Then for now, let's just console log this data just to see what we've got. So before we do that, we need to call this fetch data function like so. So if we save this now and take a look in the browser, if we refresh our localhost 3000, we can see no console log, but whenever we open up my profile, we'll see our console log. So let's see what we have on data. We have first name and last name as expected. Now let's see what happens as well when we close my profile. If we open up my profile again, we'll see another set of console logs because this profile component is re-rendering every time we open up our accordion. So if we click on our accordion again, we can see another set of console logs because our profile was re-rendered. Our profile component was re-rendered. With that said, let's set our data to some local state in our profile. So at the top here, let's go const first name and set first name and set this equal to useState. And the default state or the default value for this state item will be an empty string. We're going to do exactly the same for last name. We're going to have a last name state item and a set last name. So in here, instead of console logging data, let's just use the set first name, passing in the new value for first name, which will be data.firstname. And we want to do exactly the same for set last name. We want to set it equal to data.lastname, which means then anytime our state items change, we can render them in our markup and our markup will reflect these changes. So instead of hard-coded profile here, let's render two divs. The first one, I'm going to have a strong tag, just say first name, like so. And because we're going to use some JavaScript here, we want to reference a variable. We want to reference this first name variable. We need to open up and render this within a set of curly braces. And then we want to do exactly the same thing for the last name. Exactly the same logic here. We want to render last name like so. So if we save this now then and take a look here in the browser, we can see this has already been pulled in. It's already refreshed in the background. If we open and close this, this is actually displaying instantly because the mock API is set up on my local machine, so there's no sort of latency and things like that, and having to wait for the API call. However, in a real-world app, this will probably take like up to a second or something to resolve and to render on the screen. But there we go. It's all working correctly, and this pretty much concludes the very basic tutorial covering React components, React props, as well as some very basic React hooks, where we have also event handling and basic data fetching, all in this very basic app.